Welcome to our deep dive into the Gospel of Mark. We're diving into this incredibly dynamic text, packed with stories, miracles, and teachings of Jesus. You ready for a rapid-fire journey through all 16 chapters?
Absolutely. Mark doesn't waste any time. It jumps right into the action, giving us a unique look at Jesus' ministry.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, Mark, wastes no time throwing us right into the story with John the Baptist. It's not your typical Sunday sermon scene. John's out in the wilderness living a pretty stark existence. What's Mark trying to emphasize here?
Yeah, right from the start, Mark wants us to see that something radical is happening. John's appearance, it's fulfilling prophecy. He's the forerunner, the voice crying out, preparing the way for someone even greater, someone to come. This sets a tone of anticipation and dramatic foreshadowing that really defines Mark's style.
And then it feels like we're launched straight into Jesus' baptism. It's such a powerful image. The heavens opening, the Spirit descending like a dove, the voice from heaven declaring Jesus is God's Son. What a dramatic entrance, but then almost immediately we have Jesus driven into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. Why this sharp contrast?
I think this juxtaposition is crucial for understanding how Mark portrays Jesus. Yes, he's the Son of God, but he also experiences human struggles. This temptation scene foreshadows the challenges and the opposition that he'll face throughout his ministry. Mark wants us to understand that Jesus' path isn't going to be easy.
And it's not. No sooner does Jesus return from the wilderness than he's on the move, launching his ministry in Galilee. He's preaching, healing the sick, casting out demons. Mark really highlights Jesus' authority, especially in how he interacts with people who are considered outcasts in that society.
Exactly. Take the healing of the leper, for instance. Leprosy wasn't just a physical ailment, it was a social death sentence. By touching and healing the leper, Jesus demonstrates his power over both physical and societal boundaries. He's challenging the very fabric of their social norms.
It's like he's deliberately shaking things up.
Yeah.
And this naturally leads to some serious controversy. We see this in the next section as Jesus forgives sins, calls a tax collector as his disciple, and sparks debates about the Sabbath.
What's fascinating here is how Mark portrays Jesus navigating these confrontations. He's not afraid to challenge the religious authorities, redefine traditional understandings, and to associate with those who are marginalized. This creates a sense of tension and conflict that propels the narrative forward.
It's definitely a page-turner. Then we get this incredible collection of parables and miracles. We've got the sower, the mustard seed, the calming of the storm, the feeding of the 5,000, even walking on water. It's almost overwhelming. What do you think Mark is trying to achieve with this rapid-fire succession of powerful stories?
Mark strategically uses these parables and miracles to reveal the nature of Jesus' authority and the mystery of the kingdom of God. The parables, with their vivid imagery and sometimes cryptic messages, force us to think deeply about spiritual truths. The miracles, on the other hand, offer tangible evidence of Jesus' power and compassion.
And it's in these miracles that the disciples really start to grapple with who Jesus is. Peter even declares him to be the Christ. It seems like a turning point. But then Jesus immediately starts talking about his suffering and death. Why introduce this somber note so abruptly?
This is where we see the complexity of Mark's narrative skill. Just when you think the disciples have it figured out, Jesus introduces the idea of suffering, a theme that will dominate the rest of the gospel. The transfiguration scene where Jesus is revealed in divine glory further complicates matters. It's a glimpse into his true nature, but also a foreshadowing of the difficult path ahead.
It's like Mark is constantly challenging our expectations, forcing us to reevaluate what we think we know about Jesus and his mission. And this theme of suffering really comes to the forefront in the next section as Jesus continues to teach and prepare his disciples for what's to come. This is where we see Jesus having some very difficult conversations. He talks about divorce, embraces children, and challenges a rich young man to let go of his possessions and follow him. Mark really emphasizes the cost of discipleship, highlighting the sacrifices and challenges that come with truly following Jesus. And these challenges intensify as we enter the final days of Jesus' life. The tension builds with Judas's betrayal, the Last Supper, Jesus' agony in Gethsemane, the arrest, the trials, and finally the crucifixion. Mark doesn't shy away from the raw emotions of these events. It's a gut-wrenching read. Why do you think Mark chose to portray the Passion with such visceral detail?
I think Mark wants us to experience the full weight of Jesus' sacrifice. It's not a sanitized or romanticized version of the story. He uses vivid language and stark imagery to convey the physical and emotional suffering that Jesus endured. This is a pivotal moment in human history, and Mark wants us to feel the full impact of it.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word gut-wrenching. Mark's gospel is known for its raw intensity, even compared to the other gospels. He uses this almost cinematic style to draw us into the story. It makes you feel like you're right there witnessing these events unfold.
You're right, it's not for the faint of heart. But then, after all that, we get this incredible twist. The women arrive at the tomb expecting to anoint Jesus' body, but it's empty. There's an angel there who tells them that Jesus is risen and tells them to go tell the disciples. It feels like a sudden shift from despair to hope.
The resurrection is the climax of Mark's gospel. It's the ultimate victory over death and the foundation of the Christian faith. But as you pointed out, Mark ends his gospel rather abruptly. He doesn't describe any post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, which has led to centuries of debate and speculation. That's what makes it so fascinating. It's like Mark leaves us hanging, but in a way that sparks our curiosity and invites us to ponder the implications of the resurrection.
Exactly. Mark's ending challenges us to wrestle with the mystery of the resurrection and its significance for our own lives. It's an invitation to continue the story, to become part of the ongoing narrative of faith.
So we've got this whirlwind tour of Mark's gospel, hitting all the major points from John the Baptist to the empty tomb. But what really sets Mark apart from the other gospels, we know it's the shortest, but what else makes it unique?
One of the most striking things about Mark's gospel is its focus on action. It's filled with vivid descriptions, dramatic scenes, and a sense of urgency. He uses the word immediately over 40 times. This creates a fast-paced, almost breathless narrative that pulls the reader along.
Yes, it feels very different from the Gospel of John, for example, which has a much more reflective and philosophical tone.
Exactly. Mark's primary concern is to show us what Jesus did and how he did it. He's not as interested in theological explanations or lengthy discourses. He wants to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, who came to conquer evil and establish his kingdom.
And this emphasis on action really extends to how Mark portrays the disciples, right? They're often shown struggling to understand Jesus' teachings and even failing in their attempts to follow him. It's not exactly flattering.
That's a very insightful observation. Mark doesn't shy away from showing the disciples human weaknesses. They misunderstand Jesus, they argue amongst themselves, and ultimately they abandon him during his time of need. It's a stark contrast to the idealized portrayals we sometimes see in other gospels.
Why do you think Mark chose to present the disciples in such a human, even fallible light?
I think it serves a few purposes. First, it highlights the radical nature of Jesus' teachings and actions. Even those closest to him struggled to grasp the full implications of his message. Second, it offers encouragement to ordinary believers. If even the disciples stumbled along the way, we shouldn't be discouraged by our own failings. And finally, I think it underscores the transformative power of faith. Despite their weaknesses, the disciples ultimately become the foundation of the early church. It's a testament to the power of Jesus' grace and the transformative nature of the gospel.
That's a powerful point. It makes the story so much more relatable and gives us hope that even with our flaws, we can still be part of God's plan. Now, as we go deeper into Mark's gospel, there are a few key themes that we should pay attention to. One that always seems to come up in discussions about Mark is this idea of the messianic secret. What exactly does that mean?
The messianic secret refers to the fact that Jesus repeatedly instructs people not to reveal his true identity as the Messiah. He tells those he heals to keep quiet. He silences demons who recognize him, and even commands his disciples not to tell anyone about his transfiguration. It seems like a strange strategy if you're trying to spread the good news.
Right. You'd think he'd want everyone to know who he is. So why all the secrecy? What's Mark getting at here?
Well, there are a few different interpretations. Some scholars believe that Jesus was trying to avoid premature misunderstandings about his mission. Remember, many people were expecting a political Messiah who would overthrow Roman rule, not a suffering servant who would die on a cross.
So maybe he was trying to control the narrative to ensure that people understood the true nature of his kingship.
Exactly. Others suggest that the messianic secret emphasizes the importance of faith. True understanding of Jesus' identity comes through belief, not just through outward signs and proclamations. It's not about seeing the miracles. It's about what those miracles reveal about who Jesus is.
That makes sense. It's about recognizing the presence of God's kingdom, even in the midst of suffering and opposition. Which, speaking of suffering, is another major theme that runs throughout Mark's gospel. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. From the very beginning, Jesus foreshadows his own death, and the shadow of the cross looms over the entire story. Mark doesn't shy away from the difficult aspects of discipleship. He makes it clear that following Jesus will involve sacrifice, persecution, and even death.
Like when Jesus tells the rich young man that he must give up all his possessions to follow him, it's a pretty radical call to discipleship.
And it's a call that continues to challenge us today. What are we willing to give up for the sake of the gospel? What might true discipleship cost us in our own lives?
Those are some tough questions. But Mark doesn't leave us without hope, does he? The resurrection is a powerful reminder that even death cannot defeat Jesus.
That's right. Even though Mark doesn't explicitly depict post-resurrection appearances, the empty tomb and the angel's message are filled with a sense of triumph and anticipation. Jesus has conquered death, and his followers are empowered to go forth and proclaim the good news to the world.
It's like the story isn't over. It's just beginning. Mark leaves us hanging, but in a good way. He invites us to participate in the ongoing story of Jesus' mission.
Exactly. And that's what makes Mark's gospel so relevant for us today. It's not just a historical account. It's a living word that challenges us to examine our own faith, our own commitments, and our own willingness to follow Jesus wherever that journey might lead us.
We've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive so far, from the fast-paced action and the very human portrayal of the disciples to these major themes like the messianic secret and the cost of discipleship. But there's one more fascinating layer to Mark that we should touch on. It's something that has sparked a lot of debate among biblical scholars, the different endings.
Ah, yes. The multiple endings of Mark. It's one of the most intriguing aspects of this gospel. The most widely accepted ending is the one we just discussed: the women at the tomb, the angel's message, and their fearful silence. It's how most English translations present it.
But you're saying there's more.
There is. Some ancient manuscripts include additional verses, often referred to as the longer ending of Mark.
Okay, so what do these extra verses say?
They describe Jesus appearing to the disciples, giving them instructions, and ascending into heaven.
Wow, that's quite a difference. So which ending is the real one?
That's the million-dollar question. Scholars have been debating this for centuries. It's a complex issue involving textual criticism, the study of ancient manuscripts, and their variations.
So how should we as readers approach these different endings? What does this all mean for our understanding of Mark's gospel?
I think it's important to be aware of the scholarly discussions to understand that there are different perspectives on the text, but ultimately I believe we can find meaning and inspiration in both endings.
That's a great point. Even with the variations, the core message of Mark's gospel remains the same. Jesus is the Messiah, he died and rose again, and his followers are called to continue his mission.
Exactly. The different endings might raise questions about how that mission was initially carried out, but they don't diminish the power or urgency of the call to discipleship that echoes throughout Mark's gospel.
You know, one thing that really struck me as we were talking about the messianic secret and the cost of discipleship is the sense of urgency that permeates Mark's gospel. It's like the kingdom of God isn't some far-off event. It's breaking into the present but not fully realized. It creates a sense of tension, of living in between the already and the not yet.
That's a brilliant observation. Mark's gospel is saturated with this tension between the present and the future. Jesus brings the kingdom through his words and actions, but its full realization is still to come. This creates a dynamic call to action for his followers.
So we're called to live as if the kingdom's already here, but also to be prepared for its ultimate fulfillment. It's almost like living with one foot in both worlds.
Exactly. It's a call to faithfulness, to radical discipleship, to live out the values of the kingdom, even in a world that often resists those values.
And that brings us back to the challenge of discipleship, doesn't it? What does it really mean to follow Jesus in today's world, especially when it seems like the world is moving further and further away from the values he embodied?
That's the question we all have to wrestle with. Mark doesn't give us easy answers, but he offers us a model in the person of Jesus, a model of humility, compassion, courage, and unwavering commitment to God's will.
So it's not about following a set of rules or doctrines. It's about embodying those same qualities in our own lives.
Precisely. It's about allowing Jesus' teachings to transform our hearts and minds, to shape our actions and our relationships. It's about living as agents of God's kingdom, seeking justice, mercy, and peace in a world that desperately needs those things.
Yeah, it really is a powerful and challenging book. And like you said, it's not just a historical account. It's this living word that, calls us to action and, invites us to examine our own faith. Absolutely. And what's been so fascinating for me going through this deep dive with you is realizing that the Gospel of Mark is much more complex and nuanced than I initially thought. It's not just a simple retelling of Jesus's life. It's a carefully crafted narrative with layers of meaning that, invite us to think more deeply about our own beliefs and our own actions.
It's a narrative that challenges us, provokes us, and ultimately, I believe, inspires us to live more authentically as followers of Jesus.
Yeah, one thing I'm taking away from our discussion today is the importance of looking beyond the surface level of the text. Mark uses vivid imagery, symbolism, literary techniques to convey his message. And it's up to us as readers to engage with those layers of meaning.
Absolutely. There's so much richness to be discovered when we approach the text with curiosity and a willingness to grapple with its complexities.
For example, the way that Mark portrays the disciples as flawed and struggling individuals really resonated with me. It's a reminder that discipleship isn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It's a journey of faith, and we're all works in progress.
It's a journey that requires humility, perseverance, and a willingness to learn and grow. And it's a journey we don't have to undertake alone. Mark reminds us that we're part of a community of faith, a body of believers who support and encourage one another along the way.
And speaking of community, I think it's important to remember that Mark's gospel was likely written for a specific audience, a community of early Christians who were facing persecution and hardship.
That's a crucial point. Understanding the historical context helps us appreciate the message of hope and resilience that Mark offers. He reminds his readers that even in the darkest of times, God is present and at work. The resurrection is the ultimate testament to that truth.
This deep dive has truly given me a fresh perspective on the Gospel of Mark. It's inspired me to go back and read it again, this time with a deeper appreciation for its literary artistry, its theological depth, and its enduring relevance for our lives today.
I'm so glad to hear that, and I encourage all our listeners to do the same. Take time to immerse yourselves in the Gospel of Mark. Let its story challenge you, comfort you, and transform you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Your insights have been incredibly valuable.
It's been a pleasure. And to you, our listener, thank you for embarking on this journey of discovery with us. We hope this deep dive has ignited a spark of curiosity and inspired you to explore the Gospel of Mark with fresh eyes and an open heart. Until next time, keep diving deep.